The fluorescent lights above Oak Creek Memorial's third-floor corridor buzzed like insects trapped in plastic, a sound Elena Martinez had learned to stop hearing somewhere around Year 7. She moved through the hallway at 11:04 p.m. pushing a supply cart, her white sneakers whispering against linoleum that never quite came clean no matter how hard housekeeping scrubbed. The limp was barely noticeable anymore, just a slight hitch in her left side, something the untrained eye would miss. Most people didn't look closely enough to notice anything about the overnight nursing staff. They were furniture. Background. Invisible. She was good at invisible. The roadside bomb in Helmand Province had taken a lot of things from her 12 years ago: her left anterior tibialis, her career as a combat medic, her clearance, her name from any official record that mattered. What it hadn't taken was the knowledge. The muscle memory. The absolute clarity of purpose that came from having held someone's bleeding out on a desert floor while sand swirled in the rotors of the Black Hawk screaming overhead. That stayed. It lived in her hands. It moved through her shoulders like a second spine. Elena restocked the 4 stations with methodical precision, 18-gauge needles in the plastic holder, 20-gauge beside them, catheters arranged by size like instruments in a surgical kit that wasn't hers anymore. Her movements were economical, practiced, a choreography she'd perfected across 1,000 shifts. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Just the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned that speed and precision kept people alive. She pulled her jacket closer as she moved, feeling the familiar weight of the patch sewn inside the lining. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Unit insignia, faded to near invisibility from 18 years of being pressed against her ribs. She should have removed it. Should have burned it. Instead, she'd stitched it into the hem of her scrub jacket when she took this job 2 years ago, a small defiance, a talisman, proof that some part of her still belonged to something that officially didn't exist anymore. The classified operation that had gotten her court-martialed on paper. Extracted under false conviction. Buried deeper than any grave. The night shift reset something in her. The daylight staff moved with bureaucratic weight, clipboards, protocols, the assumption that the rules made sense because they were written down. But night belonged to the people who understood that rules were suggestions made by people who'd never held a dying person in the dark. Elena preferred it here, in this quiet. Where she could do her work without being watched. Without having to wear the mask of meekness that came with being just another overnight nurse. She was passing the locker room when her jacket shifted, riding up slightly as she reached for a supply bag on the upper shelf. The patch caught the light for just a moment, enough time for muscle memory to take over and pull the fabric back down, smooth it against her ribs, hide it. But not quite fast enough. Dr. Martin Caldwell stood in the hallway entrance, surgical mask hanging around his neck like a necklace, his eyes carrying that particular coldness that came from being the most educated person in every room and never letting anyone forget it. His real power came from something else though, something institutional. He had 3 surgeons on call who owed him favors from his time running the cardiovascular unit before he'd moved into administration. He had the ear of the hospital's COO. He had the kind of quiet influence that made people step aside when he approached. He barely glanced at her. "Martinez," he said, not looking directly, just acknowledging her existence the way someone might acknowledge a mop bucket in the hallway. "Stocking supplies at this hour? Seems like you should have finished your rounds." Elena pulled herself up slightly, straightening her posture into the curve of deference she'd perfected. When she spoke, her voice came out soft, measured, deferential. The voice she wore like a second skin. "I'll be back on the floor in 5 minutes, doctor." He nodded without responding and kept walking, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of someone who owned the space he moved through. Elena waited until the sound faded before allowing her shoulders to drop back slightly. She finished straightening the supply cart and made her way back toward the patient floors, her limp barely visible in the hallway's half-light. The night moved the way good nights did, steady, manageable, routine. 2 post-op recovery patients sleeping through their sedation. An elderly man with congestive heart failure who needed his oxygen adjusted. A young woman recovering from appendicitis who asked for water 3 times and called the call button just to hear another human voice. Elena moved between them with the kind of presence that made people feel like someone was actually taking care of them. That was the thing about the overnight shift, people were vulnerable then. They let their guards down. They asked real questions. They noticed if you actually gave a damn. She was checking the vitals on the cardiac patient when the ambulance bay doors burst open downstairs, their echo reverberating up through the stairwell like thunder rolling through a canyon. Elena's hand paused on the blood pressure cuff. That sound meant trauma. Code activation. The rhythm of the hospital shifting from maintenance mode to emergency protocol. She heard the overhead page crackling. Trauma alert, Bay 3. Trauma alert, Bay 3. The next words out of the intercom changed everything. Incoming Army Ranger, unconscious, blunt trauma, estimated 6-minute ETA. Elena's hand stilled. Army Ranger. 2 words that meant nothing to most of the people in this hospital. To her, they meant something else entirely. They meant possibility. They meant the kind of person who understood things that couldn't be written in official reports. But that was the fear talking. That was the part of her that had learned to be afraid of her own history. She finished her current round on autopilot, her attention already shifting downstairs. By the time she reached the trauma bay at 11:22 p.m., the paramedics were already transferring the patient from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital bed. The man was unconscious, his Army Ranger uniform soaked in blood that had oxidized to a dark brown. Training accident, the paramedic said. Fell from height. Multiple contusions. Possible internal bleeding. Elena moved to the supply station, grabbing gloves, prepping her workspace with the kind of automatic efficiency that required no thought. But her eyes kept moving back to the patient. Something about the bone structure. Something about the way he lay there unconscious, completely defenseless. The medics had cut away his shirt, revealing a muscular chest already blooming with bruises that would become spectacular by morning. She was reaching for a 14-gauge for catheter when Dr. Caldwell appeared at the trauma bay entrance, his presence announcing itself like a pressure change in the air. He took in the scene with the kind of clinical assessment that looked professional if you didn't understand that it was really just apathy dressed up as competence. He positioned himself at the patient's head, ready to intubate if needed. Get me 2 units of O-negative on standby, Caldwell said to nobody in particular. Let's get a head CT and full trauma panel. We'll know more when he wakes up. If he wakes up. Elena was already moving toward the patient, gloves snapped on, tourniquet pulled tight around his right upper arm. The collapse vein problem was obvious immediately. The years of athletic training had left his vessels deep, rolled, difficult. Most nurses would have called for a central line by now. Would have stopped and waited for someone else to handle it. Elena instead felt the familiar sensation of her tactical awareness expanding, the same focus that had served her in the field tent outside Kandahar when the power went out and she had to work by flashlight alone. She found the cephalic vein. Palpated it. Felt the slight rebound. The 4 went in smooth and sure, one fluid motion, no fishing, no doubt. The flashback happened so fast it was almost subliminal, her hands, 12 years younger, starting and 4 on a Marine whose entire lower body had been blown sideways by an IED. Same vein. Same confidence. Same muscle memory. Good work, Caldwell said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. A notation. The kind of thing you'd say about a piece of equipment functioning correctly. Then the paramedics moved the patient's upper body to stabilize the cervical spine, and his wallet fell from his cargo pocket onto the trauma bay floor. It landed face down, and Elena found herself bending to retrieve it without conscious thought, just the automatic motion of someone who cleaned up after chaos for a living. She picked up the wallet. It was worn leather, the kind of quality you got when someone could actually afford things that lasted. She opened it to find insurance cards, a driver's license from North Carolina, and a military ID card tucked behind a photo of a woman who might have been his sister or might have been someone he'd loved. The name on the military ID was Colonel James Hendricks. The world didn't stop. The monitors didn't flatline. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker. But somewhere inside Elena's chest, something contracted with a force that felt like a surgical compression of the heart. Colonel James Hendricks. The presiding officer. The man who'd sat at the head of the court-martial hearing in that windowless room in Kandahar, his expression unreadable as the charges were read. Conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Unauthorized action during classified operation. The man who delivered the verdict that extracted her from the only life that had ever made sense. The man who destroyed her. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the kind of adrenaline surge that came from recognizing a ghost that had been chasing you through your sleep for a decade. She slipped the military ID back into the wallet with careful precision, her movements controlled and exact. Don't show anything. Don't let anyone see. That was the rule. That was always the rule. But Dr. Caldwell was watching. She felt his eyes shift from the unconscious patient to her face, then down to her hands, then back to her face again. He watched her tuck the wallet back into the patient's pocket. He watched the moment her hand shook as she did it. His expression didn't change. Doctors were trained to keep their faces neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. Something that looked like recognition. Not of who she was, but of the fact that she was reacting to something. That something had cracked in the professional mask. Elena straightened, pulled her hands back, took a measured breath that would have looked normal to anyone who didn't understand that it was actually a tactical recalibration. She turned away from the patient, from Dr. Caldwell, from the man unconscious on the trauma bay bed who'd signed the paperwork that made her disappear. She moved back toward the supply station to dispose of her gloves, her movements controlled and precise. The patch hidden in her jacket lining felt heavier than it ever had. The silence in the trauma bay was so thick you could almost operate in it. Nobody seemed to notice that anything had changed. The monitors kept beeping their steady rhythm. The foot dripped its clear fluid into the colonel's vein. The fluorescent lights buzzed their eternal buzz. But Dr. Caldwell watched her leave, his eyes narrow, calculating, already beginning to understand that there was more to the overnight nurse than anyone had bothered to notice. The compressions were precise. Elena's hands moved in the mechanical rhythm she'd learned in a sandstorm-blacked field hospital in Sanjan Valley, her knuckles driving down into Colonel Hendricks' sternum at exactly 100 beats per minute. The machine counting her tempo. The ventilator wheezed its steady mechanical breath. Around her, 3 nurses positioned monitors, drew labs, recorded vitals in real time. Everything protocol. Everything expected. Then her jacket shifted. It happened during the 5th compression cycle, her scrub jacket riding up slightly as her weight transferred downward, the fabric pulling taut across her ribs. For just a fraction of a second, the inside lining caught the fluorescent overhead light. A faded olive patch. Embroidered call sign. Unit designation that didn't exist in any official military registry because it had been officially erased from every record in 2019. Dr. Caldwell stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped behind his back, ostensibly monitoring the resuscitation protocol. His eyes were steady. Clinical. Then they narrowed. Not with concern for the patient. With recognition. Elena felt the moment his gaze sharpened on that exposed patch, a fraction of a second when the mask slipped from physician to something else. Something calculating. His chin tilted slightly upward. A micro-expression, understanding. The kind of understanding that came from having access to classified briefings, or from knowing someone who did. Elena tucked the patch back down as she continued compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The motion was practiced, automatic, leaving her face blank. But Caldwell had already seen it. Already made the connection between the overnight nurse and whatever unit had trained her in a place that didn't officially exist. The resuscitation continued for another 17 minutes. Colonel Hendricks' rhythm returned. Sinus, stable, holding. The crisis passed. The room exhaled. Elena stepped back from the bed, her gloved hands peeling away from his chest, and she did not look toward the doorway where Caldwell stood watching her with eyes like a hawk calculating prey. What they didn't know was how much Caldwell already knew. What they didn't know was that he'd spent the last 6 years climbing toward the chief of staff position, and that position required more than just competence, it required leverage. It required knowing things. It required understanding which people in his hospital posed threats to his trajectory, and which could be neutralized before they became problems. The next morning, the unit board near the break room displayed something new. Elena's eyes found it as she clocked in at 3:58 a.m. for her overnight shift. Her name. Her schedule. Rotating shifts for a.m. to noon. Every other day. No consistency. No routine. And the ICU access notation had been revised, a new policy, effective immediately, restricting floor nurses to post-op recovery and discharge paperwork only. Attending physicians and their designated clinical liaisons only beyond the ICU threshold. The policy had Caldwell's signature dated that morning at 6:19 a.m. Elena read the notice twice, feeling nothing, which was exactly how she'd trained herself to feel when tactical situations shifted. Acknowledgement without emotion. Adaptation without visible strain. She clipped her badge to her scrubs, the same scrubs with the same patch sewn inside the same lining, and moved to the supply closet to begin her shift. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days into the new rotation, Elena sat in the break room at 6:15 a.m. with a sandwich she wasn't hungry for and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Martha Chen, who'd worked nights beside her for 7 months, sat 2 tables away with the sandwich Elena had seen her make yesterday. The same brand. The same crust. They'd eaten together every Tuesday morning for 23 weeks without missing once. Martha gathered her things. Didn't make eye contact. Moved to the opposite corner of the room where Sarah Voss was already seated. Within seconds, 3 other nurses had migrated toward that table, creating an island of warmth and conversation on the far side of the break room. Elena took one measured breath. Stared at her sandwich. Did not look up. Did not blink. The isolation wasn't the point. She'd lived in isolation before, in places where isolation meant safety. What mattered was that Caldwell had orchestrated this with the precision of a man who understood institutional hierarchy. These nurses hadn't decided to avoid her on their own. They'd been signaled. Warned. Given the impression that association with Elena Martinez was somehow problematic. She finished her coffee in silence. Disposed of the sandwich without tasting it. Moved back to post-op recovery where her assignment was waiting. But Caldwell wasn't finished. That afternoon, near the supply closet on the 3rd floor, his voice came from behind her. Not loud. Conversational. Martinez, isn't it? I've noticed you seem emotionally invested in our military patient. That's not professional. Elena turned. Met his eyes. Her voice, when it came, was steady and deferential exactly as she'd learned to make it. I provide equal care to all patients, doctor. He smiled. His teeth were very white. His eyes were very cold. Of course. But I'll be monitoring closely. We can't have Florence Nightingale here getting attached to anyone. That's when mistakes happen. That's when protocols break down. He walked past her without waiting for a response, his shoes clicking against the tile with a rhythm like a countdown. 2 days later, Colonel Hendrick's adult daughter arrived during afternoon rounds. She was wearing a blazer with a Pentagon visitor's pass clip to the lapel. Her face was the color of raw beef when she found Elena checking the colonel's for line during what should have been a routine medication administration. Why hasn't his pain medication been given? The daughter's voice had the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The chart says every 4 hours. It's been 6. Elena checked the medication orders. There were none. Not for the last 6 hours. Not for the 6 hours before that. The orders existed in the system, signed by Caldwell, but there was no corresponding documentation of administration. The morphine had never been dispensed because Caldwell had entered the orders into the system without triggering the automatic nurse notification. Caldwell appeared in the doorway as if he'd been waiting. Arms crossed. The expression of a man who'd orchestrated exactly this moment. Ms. Martinez, he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional disappointment, can you explain this negligence? The daughter's voice rose. You people are incompetent. My father is a decorated officer and you're treating him like he's nobody. Elena felt the moment expand. The moment where she could defend herself, could explain, could point toward the medication orders that Caldwell had deliberately sequenced to create this exact gap. The moment where she could say his name and expose the calculation. She took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape, not from emotion but from the precise pressure release of someone who understood that crying would be more convincing than anger. Wiped it without breaking eye contact with Caldwell in the doorway. I will continue providing the best care I can with the resources you permit me. The daughter's face cycled through confusion and then rage, but Elena was already turning back to the fore, already documenting the gap in real time, already moving like someone who'd accepted the injustice and would endure it with dignity. That was the performance that would matter later. That was the composure that would echo through depositions and investigations and reviews. Caldwell's satisfaction was visible in the slight relaxation of his posture. That evening, Elena passed the unit board on her way to clock out. A new document had been posted. Formal, centered, laminated. Emotional involvement with patients, Elena Martinez. The write-up detailed her observation of Colonel Hendrick's care with language that made professional concern sound like personal attachment. It recommended monitoring. It suggested that future assignments be evaluated for objectivity. It was, technically, not inaccurate. She had been emotionally invested, though not for the reasons Caldwell implied. Every nurse who passed that board saw her name. Saw the accusation. Understood the signal. Caldwell stood at the nursing station 30 feet away, watching her read it. Satisfaction evident in his posture. Confidence in the setup. He'd isolated her from colleagues, restricted her access, and branded her as compromised. All within policy. All defensible. All strategic. Elena read the notice once. Committed the exact wording to memory. Did not show reaction. Clipped her badge back into her pocket and walked toward the exit. 3 hours after finding Colonel Hendrick's military ID, she'd understood what he was. After 3 days of Caldwell's orchestration, she understood what Caldwell was too, not a bully, but a strategist. Someone who recognized that she was dangerous not because of what she'd done, but because of what she might remember. What she might know. She drove home through Philadelphia rain, the city lights reflecting off wet asphalt like scattered shell casings. By the time she reached her apartment, she'd already begun calculating angles. Already understood that this wasn't going to end with a write-up on a unit board. Already knew that surviving Caldwell required a different kind of precision than she'd ever learned in Helmand Province. The monitor's alarm pierced the midnight silence like a scream nobody wanted to hear. Elena was 3 floors below, documenting discharge summaries in the break room when the intercom crackled to life, code blue, ICU Bay 7. Her chest tightened. She didn't need to check the sensors board. She already knew which patient occupied that bay. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual dead song as she moved toward the stairwell, but something in her bones had shifted, the same pressure change that preceded IED detonations in Sanjin Valley. She climbed 4 stairs at a time. The ICU doors burst open and Elena saw the cascade immediately. Monitors screaming. Nurses gathered around a bed like vultures over carrion. Blood pressure 64/38 and falling. Oxygen saturation dropping from 94 to 88 to 82. The ventilator's rhythmic wheeze became labored, panicked. Colonel James Hendrick's chest rose and fell in the jerky, desperate patterns of a body in hemorrhagic shock. Internal bleed, one of the rotating nurses called out, a second-year resident who looked like she'd never seen a pressure drop below 90. He's bleeding out. We need Caldwell now. Elena pushed through the gathered staff, her eye scanning the monitors with the precision of someone who'd read vital signs in blacked-out tents during sandstorm blackouts. Pressure still falling. O2 sat now 79. Pupils dilating, that fixed, blown look that meant brain death was minutes away. The man who'd destroyed her military career was circling the drain on her shift, in her hospital, under her watch, and the only surgeon authorized to intervene was nowhere to be found. She keyed the overhead intercom. Dr. Caldwell to ICU Bay 7. Immediate surgical emergency. Patient coding. Static. Then his secretary's voice, crisp and clinical. Dr. Caldwell is in an emergency board meeting regarding the chief of staff position. He cannot be disturbed. Elena's jaw tightened. An emergency board meeting at 12:33 in the morning. The lie was so transparent she could see through it like dirty glass. Caldwell was laying low, letting her drown, making sure she'd have to move without authorization so he could pull the termination trigger the moment this ended. He'd orchestrated this, the staffing shortage, his convenient absence, the explicit order left with his secretary that no advanced procedures could proceed without his direct supervision. This wasn't negligence. This was theater. Calculated, ruthless, perfect theater. She called again. Patient critical. Requires immediate surgical intervention. Blood pressure 62 and dropping. The secretary's response came back colder than the ICU air. Dr. Caldwell left explicit instructions. No advanced procedures without his direct supervision. Stabilize and wait. Stabilize and wait. The cruelest equation in medicine. You cannot stabilize hemorrhagic shock without surgery. You cannot wait when the clock is measured in minutes. Elena stood at the foot of Colonel Hendrick's bed, watching the man who'd signed the papers that officially erased her military career from existence, and felt the weight of every decision she'd made in the last 18 hours collapse into this single moment. The monitor screamed again. Blood pressure 58/31. Oxygen saturation 71. Elena's hands moved without conscious thought. She crossed to the crash cart in the corner, the one locked with a keycode access system that she absolutely did not have authorization to breach. The surgical kit inside, sutures, retractors, titanium clamps, instruments that belonged in operating rooms attended by credentialed surgeons, not overnight nurses, was explicitly forbidden to her. The lock clicked open with the access code she'd memorized 3 years ago after her first critical patient who'd needed emergency intervention. Caldwell had written that access code on the staff board when he first arrived. Nobody had ever changed it. The surgical instruments felt like coming home. Her hands reached for the trauma shears, not the blunt nurse's shears with the plastic handles, but the heavy-gauge surgical scissors used for opening chest cavities when there was no time for elegance. The weight of it in her palm carried muscle memory that no official hospital credential would ever acknowledge. 12 years since Helmand Province. 12 years since she'd held a human heart in her hands in a surgical tent lit by chemical lanterns while sand scratched at her eyelids and the percussion of artillery echoed through the valley. 12 years, and it all came back in a single breath. She moved to Hendrick's bedside. The resident who'd called the code stepped back instinctively, not because Elena had said anything, but because her movements had shifted from nurse to surgeon. The transition was subtle, invisible to untrained eyes. A straightening of the spine. The way her hands positioned themselves with absolute certainty. The absence of hesitation. The presence of something older and more lethal than anything hospital protocol could contain. Get me 2 units of O-negative. 2-liter bags of normal saline. And clear the room except trauma team, Elena said. Not a request. Not phrased as a suggestion. A command, delivered in a voice that was no longer deferential. The resident didn't question her. Nobody questioned her. The nurses began moving instruments, clearing the space, responding to authority they could hear even if they couldn't name it. Elena positioned herself at Hendrick's left side. The crash cart held everything she needed. The field thoracotomy was a procedure designed for combat zones when there was no time for OR protocol, when the alternative to violating medical authority was letting someone die. She'd performed it 17 times in Helmand Province. Never once in civilian medicine. Never once with a patient whose court-martial order still sat in a classified file somewhere in the Pentagon's archives. The scalpel felt like reunion. She made the first incision with the precision of someone who'd done this in sandstorm darkness, in tents that shook from IED concussions, with hands that trembled from adrenaline but never from doubt. Between the 4th and 5th ribs. The skin opened like an argument finally being resolved. Blood pooled immediately, dark, arterial, the color of secrets finally spilling out. The surgical scissors followed, cutting through tissue with the snick-snick-snick of metal on meat, sounds that her body remembered even if her civilian life wanted to forget them. The intercostal muscles parted. The pleural membrane opened, and air hissed out, that familiar exhalation of a body's private spaces becoming suddenly external. She reached into the cavity with hands that belonged to a major in the Army Medical Corps, not a registered nurse in Philadelphia. Her fingers found the source of the bleed almost immediately, a ruptured spleen that had decompensated from the original trauma. No time for salvage. No time for subtlety. I need the hemostatic clamp. Now. The resident placed it in her open palm without hesitation. Elena clamped the splenic artery with the controlled violence of someone who'd learned that hesitation was the only fatal mistake. Blood flow stopped. The internal hemorrhage halted mid-cascade. She positioned absorbent gauze to stabilize the remaining damage, working with the economy of motion that separated civilians from people who'd learned medicine in the space between life and death. The monitor's scream began to lower its pitch. The tone shifted from desperate to urgent. Blood pressure began climbing. 65, 72. 79, the numbers that meant the difference between cardiac arrest and another chance. Her hand steadied with each climbing number, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone operating from pure anatomical knowledge rather than authorized procedure. Every movement was muscle memory from a war zone that officially didn't exist. 23 minutes later, Colonel James Hendrick's vitals had stabilized into the range that meant survival became possible. Elena stepped back from the bed, looking at her hands. Blood covered her scrubs from wrists to elbows. The surgical instruments lay scattered across the crash cart like evidence. The room smelled like copper and antiseptic and the sharp metallic tang of hemorrhage, a scent that carried her back to every combat surgery, every sandstorm tent, every time she'd held a human life in her hands and refused to let it slip away. The resident stared at her in absolute silence. The other nurses had stopped moving. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed their dead song over a room that had transformed from ICU to battlefield and back again in less than half an hour. Elena peeled off her gloves. The gesture itself was a transformation, like shedding a skin. Get him to radiology. Confirm the bleed is stopped. Start 2 units of blood. Continuous monitoring. Her voice had dropped an octave. The words came out as orders, not suggestions. As commands from someone who'd operated in theater, not someone who'd been written up on a unit board for emotional involvement. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Dr. Caldwell was already receiving the call. The worst part was understanding that every second of this procedure, every violated protocol, every use of equipment she wasn't authorized to touch, would be documented. The secretary who'd blocked his arrival would have it on record. The resident would have it on record. Every nurse in this unit would have witnessed a registered nurse performing open-heart surgical intervention without supervision, without authorization, without the credentialing that made it legal. The worst part was knowing that Elena Martinez had just bought her freedom with her career. She moved to the sink and began washing the blood away, watching it spiral down the drain in patterns like a spiral staircase leading downward. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She'd learned long ago that the trembling always came later, always came in private moments when no one was watching. In public, in the face of institutional power trying to destroy her, composure was the only weapon that mattered. The intercom crackled to life. Dr. Caldwell's voice, sharp and controlled, who authorized the field thoracotomy? Elena didn't turn around from the sink. She simply finished washing her hands with the same methodical precision she'd used to save the life of the man who destroyed hers, and then she turned to face whatever came next. The 12-lead monitor flatlined. No pulse. No pressure. Nothing but the white noise of a system shutting down. Elena's hands moved before her mind caught up. She didn't think about protocol or authorization or the fact that Caldwell would crucify her for this. Muscle memory took over, 12 years of combat medicine in sandstorm black tents, of operating by flashlight in forward operating bases when the choppers couldn't fly, of keeping soldiers alive when a scalpel and field supplies were the only mercy available. She reached for the surgical kit Caldwell had locked in the medication cabinet. The lock gave in 3 seconds. Her hands had learned to break things efficiently. The 14-gauge angiocath needle came first. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't hesitate. The needle penetrated, and the hiss of air escaping told her everything. Tension pneumothorax compressing Hendrik's heart, suffocating him from inside his own chest. One problem solved. One breath of reprieve. The monitor ticked upward. 78, 82. Not enough. The thoracotomy came next. The scalpel moved like it was remembering a dance it had perfected 1,000 times before. Elena made the incision with the kind of precise violence that separated surgeons from nurses, civilians from soldiers who'd spent tours watching chest cavities open under her hands. The blood came. That was expected. That was data. Pain was information, and Elena had spent her life translating pain into survival. The pericardial sac opened. Hendrik's heart lay exposed and silent, bruised purple from the internal bleeding, drowning in its own fluid. Elena's fingers entered the surgical field without trembling, without hesitation, without any of the doubt that should have made this moment impossible. She clamped the descending thoracic aorta with her fingers, direct pressure stopping the hemorrhage long enough for the 4 lines to catch up. Push 1 milligram epinephrine. Squeeze the bag valve mask twice. Wait. The heart twitched. Once. Twice. Sinus rhythm bloomed across the monitor like someone had switched a light back on. Elena stood there, blood coating her forearms past the elbows, watching Colonel James Hendricks, the man who'd court-martialed her, destroyed her career, reduced 12 years of service to a classified footnote, breathe air that she'd just given him back. The ICU nurses were frozen. Chen's mouth hung open. Martha had stepped backward into the corner, her badge clattered against the wall, the sound of it metallic and small. Elena didn't acknowledge them. She finished securing the thoracotomy with sutures that moved with a surgeon's precision, because somewhere in the darkness of this hospital, in the abandonment of protocol and career, she'd stopped being a nurse. She'd become something else entirely. Something that frightened people who could read the evidence written across her hands. The monitor showed 118/76 and climbing. The oxygen sat stabilized at 94%. Hendricks was alive because she'd been willing to incinerate herself to keep that true. It took exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds from flatline to stabilization. Just enough time to end everything. The doors to the ICU burst open at 12:06 a.m. Dr. Caldwell stood in the threshold, his white coat pristine, his hair perfectly arranged. His board meeting apparently concluded the exact moment Hendricks' heart restarted. He didn't move at first. He simply surveyed the room, the surgical instruments laid out on the trauma cart, the thoracotomy incision still visible beneath the fresh bandage, Elena's blood-soaked scrubs clinging to her frame like evidence of a crime. His eyes passed over Colonel Hendricks, still unconscious and breathing, still alive against any reasonable calculation. Then they found Elena at the sink, washing her hands with the same methodical precision she'd used to save the life of the man who'd destroyed hers. She didn't turn around at first. She simply finished, watching the blood spiral down the drain, turning copper and then clear. When she finally faced him, her composure was absolute, not rigid, not defensive, but the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could deliver. Caldwell's smile was cold and small, a calculation rather than an expression. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't acknowledge that she'd performed a miracle. Instead, his voice arrived sharp as a surgical instrument. "Ms. Martinez. My office. Now." She followed him through the corridors without argument. They passed the break room where the nurses watched her disappear. They passed the write-up board where her name was still displayed in black text. They passed the ICU window where Hendricks breathed steadily, unknowing, unaware that his salvation had just triggered his savior's crucifixion. Caldwell's office was precisely arranged, books on shelves in size order, desk cleared except for his computer, everything positioned to project control and authority. He didn't sit. He remained standing, which meant Elena remained standing, which established the dynamic before a single accusation was voiced. "You performed a surgical procedure. He said it like a prosecutor opening a case. Without authorization. Without physician supervision. You used equipment restricted to physicians under state medical board regulations. You violated every protocol this hospital maintains. You violated every requirement of your nursing license. Elena kept her hands at her sides. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, not from fear but from the transition happening inside her, the shift from nurse to soldier, from compliant to commanding. The patient was coding. You were unreachable. I made the choice to save his life. You made the choice to end your career. Caldwell's smile widened fractionally. Security will escort you out. You're terminated effective immediately. Your access is revoked. Your parking pass is null. You will not contact patients or staff. You will not access any hospital systems. You have 1 hour to remove your belongings from the building. He reached for his phone before she could respond. The first call went to Jefferson Hospital's chief of staff, his voice modulated and reasonable. Yes, we had to terminate a nurse tonight. Unsupervised surgical intervention. Extremely dangerous. No, I wouldn't recommend employment. Liability risk is substantial. The second call went to Temple. The third to Pennsylvania Hospital. Each conversation followed the same script, a coordinated assassination of her professional viability across Philadelphia's entire hospital network. He was blacklisting her systematically, methodically, the way someone blacklists a threat they've decided cannot be tolerated. Elena understood then, this was the endgame he'd orchestrated from the moment Caldwell discovered that patch. He'd manufactured a situation where she would either let Colonel Hendricks die on his watch or expose herself as something more than a civilian nurse. Either way, she became a liability. Either way, she was removed. The court-martial 12 years ago had already classified her. The patch inside her jacket had just activated that classification into a problem he needed solving. He handed her a termination letter, already prepared, already dated, already processed before tonight's shift had even begun. His font was professional, his language devastating, his documentation perfect enough that she couldn't fight it in any venue that mattered. She'd violated protocol. The evidence was documented. The legal exposure was clear. Security appeared at the office door. 2 guards she recognized from the evening shifts, their expressions professionally neutral. Caldwell nodded toward the door. Clean out your locker. You have 20 minutes. They'll supervise. The locker room was empty at 1:15 a.m. Most of the hospital slept while she packed her life into a cardboard box she found behind the break room. The faded unit patch came first, the one Caldwell had seen shifting during compressions, the one from a unit that officially didn't exist. She peeled it carefully from the inside of her scrub jacket lining, held it for a moment, then laid it flat in the box. Next came the cracked mug from her commissioning ceremony, the one that had survived the roadside bombing in Helmand Province because it was ceramic and hidden in her rucksack when the IED detonated. The half-dead succulent came next, the plant she'd brought here 18 months ago as a symbol of her fresh start, the one that had slowly withered despite her attempts at careful maintenance. Finally, the photograph of her unit from Helmand Province, all 18 members arranged in the dust outside FOB Shank, faces young and alive and marked with dust. She packed it all carefully, knowing that the rain was coming and that cardboard doesn't survive water. Martha and Chen watched from the break room doorway as Elena passed them a final time. Neither met her eyes. Martha studied her shoes. Chen pressed her lips together and looked away. The security guards escorted her past the write-up board where Caldwell's words about emotional involvement still hung in black text. They escorted her past the ICU where Hendricks breathed steadily in unconsciousness, unaware that the woman who'd saved his life was being erased from the building. They escorted her through the automatic doors and into the Philadelphia night. The rain came down in sheets, the kind of rain that hits the pavement like applause, relentless and cold and indifferent to circumstance. Elena stood at the bus stop on Market Street at 1:08 a.m., cardboard box balanced on her hip, watching the water seep into the corners. The rain soaked through the cardboard first, slow penetration, then accelerating. The photograph of her unit began to warp, the faces blurring into abstraction. The commissioning mug filled with water, its cracked surface spreading the damage like a network of fractures. The succulent, already drowning in life, drowned again, its delicate leaves becoming translucent. She didn't board the 2 a.m. bus when it arrived. She just stood in the rain, watching her carefully rebuilt civilian life dissolve like ink in water, exactly as her military career had dissolved 12 years before, exactly as every attempt at reinvention seemed designed to dissolve in this city where even the rain felt like abandonment. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in the darkness, in a hospital that no longer wanted her, in a profession that had just learned she'd lied through every day of her employment, Colonel James Hendricks was alive because she'd been willing to burn everything to keep that true. And she had no idea that burning everything had just activated a system that worked on an entirely different timescale. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as the routine background check began, the one that should have taken 3 days, the one that would end careers instead. Oak Creek Memorial's compliance department ran standard verification protocols on all personnel involved in the Hendricks malpractice inquiry. Elena Martinez's name appeared in the system. The database flagged something. Then flagged it again. Classified. Level 5 clearance. Active security status despite her discharge. Hands trembled as files were reopened, files that had been sealed by Pentagon order, files that shouldn't have been accessible to civilian hospital administrators. The compliance director, Patricia Wong, sat at her desk at 10:08 a.m. and made a call to Chief Administrative Officer Michael Wilson. 18 words, "We need to talk about Major Elena Martinez right now. Bring legal." Wilson's face went grey when Wong walked him through what the background check had revealed. Not Elena's military service, that disclosure violated federal protocols that Wong had unknowingly triggered by running the check. But the implications cascaded. If Elena held classified clearance, if she'd been court-martialed under documented Pentagon procedures, if she'd worked under federal protected status that the hospital had somehow missed, then Dr. Caldwell's termination of a protected federal employee constituted interference with national security arrangements. Wilson looked at legal counsel David Bennett, who looked like a man watching his hospital's accreditation vanish in real time. "Call the Pentagon," Bennett said. "Right now." The response came from Colonel James Hendricks himself, now awake in his hospital bed, now reviewing with crystalline clarity what had happened during those 72 hours between Elena finding his military ID and saving his life on an operating table she had no authorization to use. Federal investigators sat beside his bed, 2 agents from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, recording every word. Hendricks' voice carried the measured precision of a senior officer giving testimony, each sentence constructed with deliberate weight. Major Elena Martinez was court-martialed on paper, he stated, as part of a classified extraction protocol when a joint CIA-Army intelligence operation in Sanjin Valley experienced compromise. The court-martial was documentary cover to remove her from active theater without alerting hostile intelligence to her operational status. The agents nodded, transcribing. Hendricks continued, her actual service record includes 2 silver stars for heroism under fire, a Purple Heart from the IED incident that medically discharged her, and a second Purple Heart from a separate combat engagement. She saved my life twice, once during that intelligence operation when she performed emergency field surgery on a punctured lung while rounds impacted the shelter wall, and once 72 hours ago when she performed a thoracotomy without authorization because I was dying and her commanding officer was unavailable. He paused, letting the weight settle. If Dr. Caldwell hadn't deliberately delayed treatment authorizations, hadn't withheld medication orders, hadn't made himself unreachable during that staffing shortage, the situation would have been managed through proper channels. His actions were not medical, they were strategic sabotage of a decorated officer's recovery. The agents exchanged glances. One of them made a call, Channel 6 News. Dr. Caldwell sat in his high-backed chair at 4:33 p.m., hands folded in practiced confidence, studio makeup applied by a professional who understood how to frame a narrative. Channel 6 anchor Jessica Torres adjusted her earpiece, counted down from 10, and went live at 6:04 p.m. For million viewers across Philadelphia and the surrounding counties tuned into the evening news. Dr. Caldwell, Torres began, "You recently terminated a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial. Walk our viewers through what happened." Caldwell leaned forward, his voice modulated to concerned physician frequency. "Jessica, this is fundamentally about patient safety. I discovered that an employee was performing dangerous, unauthorized surgical procedures, specifically, operating on patients without proper medical credentials, without surgical training, without institutional authorization. When I initiated disciplinary review, I discovered discrepancies in her background information. Undisclosed military service, possible combat-related PTSD, behavioral inconsistencies that I believe pose a risk to patient care." He paused for effect, his competence as physician armor gleaming. "I made the difficult but necessary decision to terminate her employment." Torres nodded, preparing her follow-up. Then her hand went to her earpiece. Her face shifted. "Doctor," she said slowly, "I'm told we have a caller who wants to respond to your claims. We're going to put them on the air." Caldwell's confidence flickered, a micro-expression, barely visible. "I don't think that's the appropriate forum for," the studio monitor illuminated. Caller identified as Department of Defense. A woman's voice came through the speakers, calm as surgical steel. "Dr. Caldwell, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, Pentagon Public Affairs Office. I'm calling to correct several statements you just made on live television to 4 million viewers." Caldwell's complexion drained. Chen's voice continued, "The nurse you terminated, Major Elena Martinez, was working under federal protected employment status following her medical discharge. Her military service was not undisclosed, it was classified under national security protocols that you violated by publicly discussing it." Caldwell tried to speak. "I was never informed that." Chen didn't slow. "You were informed the moment you glimpsed her unit patch and began systematic harassment. You manipulated her schedule, restricted her hospital access, orchestrated public humiliation through that write-up on your unit board, and deliberately delayed response to a patient crisis to manufacture grounds for termination." The studio had gone silent. Journalists could sense the professional scaffolding collapsing. Chen's tone remained level. "You orchestrated coordination with Temple Hospital, Jefferson Hospital, and Pennsylvania Hospital to prevent her future employment, a pattern that constitutes restraint of trade under federal statute. You withheld medication orders for Colonel Hendricks. You made yourself unavailable during a Level 1 trauma to force an unauthorized surgical response that would give you grounds to remove Major Martinez from employment." Caldwell stood, began to remove his microphone. Torres' voice cut through. "Dr. Caldwell, Lieutenant Colonel Chen isn't finished." Chen delivered the final statement. "The Department of Defense is coordinating with Oak Creek Memorial's administration and the Pennsylvania Medical Board regarding your conduct. Federal investigators are reviewing whether your actions constitute interference with a protected military officer, deliberate patient endangerment, and conspiracy to commit medical negligence. The Army's Office of Special Counsel is opening a formal investigation into your professional conduct. Major Martinez performed that unauthorized thoracotomy because a senior officer was dying and you had made that officer's care impossible through deliberate action." The broadcast continued. Million viewers watched Dr. Caldwell's carefully constructed narrative dissolve in real time. He stood, removed his microphone without speaking, and walked off the set while cameras still captured every step of his departure. His face had the hollow look of a man who just realized that competence at institutional sabotage is worthless when the institution is observed by federal law enforcement and broadcast to the entire metropolitan area. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the story exploded across every medical network, every news cycle, every professional channel. A Philadelphia physician had attempted to destroy a decorated service member, had gone on live television to discredit her as unstable, and had been systematically dismantled by the Pentagon in front of 4 million witnesses. 6 months later, Elena Martinez walked through Oak Creek Memorial's main entrance wearing a crisp white coat embroidered with Director of Emergency Medicine. The same antiseptic smell filled the corridors. The same ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the ICU. But the hallway that once displayed Dr. Caldwell's written condemnation on the unit board now held something else, a military portrait of Elena in dress army uniform, her hair uniform regulation tight, her eyes carrying the particular calm that comes from surviving catastrophe. Beneath the photograph, a bronze plaque read, Major Elena Martinez, United States Army, 2 silver stars, Purple Heart. Thank you for your service. She passed it every morning now. Didn't stop. Didn't look. Just walked through those corridors with the authority of someone who'd learned that recognition was less important than competence. The position had come with full back pay, a public apology from Wilson that included his own professional humiliation, and complete restructuring authority over emergency medicine protocols. Martha, the veteran nurse who'd left the break room when Caldwell orchestrated Elena's isolation, now worked under her supervision and had offered a formal apology that Elena accepted with measured grace. You were following the culture he created. We change it together now. Chen, the nurse who'd witnessed the break room exodus, contributed critical statements to federal investigators about Caldwell's systematic isolation tactics. The 2 nurses who'd provided medication orders Elena asked for, nurses who'd been terrified of Caldwell's authority, had both requested transfer to Elena's department once she took the director position. They worked together now, the break room culture transformed entirely. Colonel James Hendricks recovered fully from his injuries, returned to active duty as commanding officer of his unit, and sent quarterly emails updating Elena on the rangers she'd served with in Helmand Province, soldiers whose names she still carried in muscle memory and prayer. The court-martial paperwork was officially vacated by Pentagon order, her full-service record unsealed, her security clearance reinstated at level 5, her commissioning mug now on her office desk, repaired with gold seams in the Japanese kintsugi tradition. The succulent that she'd watched deteriorate at the bus stop 6 months ago, that she'd brought to her apartment and nearly discarded 3 times, it now thrived on her office windowsill, impossible green against the Philadelphia skyline. The photograph of her lost unit from Helmand Province, the one that had been dissolving in rain-soaked cardboard, hung in her office between her diplomas and her medical licenses. Dr. Caldwell's medical license was suspended for 3 years by the Pennsylvania Medical Board following official findings of patient endangerment, harassment of protected federal personnel, and restraint of trade through systematic blacklisting. The suspension included mandatory ethics training and a public censure that would follow his name in any professional database. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately not filed. The Defense Department determined that professional destruction was sufficient consequence. Elena occasionally drove past his current workplace on 13th and Carpenter, a strip mall office with a folding table visible through the window, supplemental insurance brochures stacked beside a small nameplate identifying him as an independent contractor. He sold policies to walk-in customers now, his presence reduced a cautionary tale in medical schools across Philadelphia, a teaching example of what happens when authority becomes weapon and competence becomes justification for cruelty. On this particular morning, Elena conducted orientation for 20 new nurses, fresh graduates who'd never heard of Dr. Caldwell, who only knew the hospital through its new protocols and policies implemented since she took the director position. She stood before them, remembering her first day at Oak Creek 12 years ago, limping silently into anonymity. Emergency medicine, she told them, is about seeing what others miss. It's about acting when action costs you everything. It's about saving lives, especially when those lives belong to people who've hurt you. After orientation ended, she walked to the ICU, checking on a young veteran, recently medically discharged, struggling with the transition to civilian anonymity. Elena sat beside his bed, let him see the slight limp she no longer hid, the unit patch she now wore openly on her coat, the same patch that had been sewn inside her jacket lining just 6 months ago, the secret that had nearly cost her everything. Recovery isn't linear, she told him. Sometimes you lose everything twice before you find where you belong. That evening, she returned to her office, reviewed department performance metrics, approved new hiring requests. Through her window, she watched the same bus stop where she'd stood in dissolving rain, cardboard box collapsing in her arms. Her phone buzzed, a text from Colonel Hendricks, heard about your new role. The Army's loss is Philadelphia's gain. Proud to have served with you, Major. Elena typed back, the honor was mine, Colonel. She turned off her office light, locked the door, walked through corridors where her portrait now hung. The same hospital, transformed. Elena's story is a reminder that hidden strength walks among us every day, in scrubs, in quiet dignity, in the people we underestimate. If you've worked alongside someone with a Secret Service history, If you've ever been underestimated and proven them wrong, if you know a decorated veteran working in the community without recognition, please share their story. Subscribe, like, and comment with your thoughts. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.